and welcome everybody to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today we are looking at a bit of a guide to navigating R&D tax credits. So if this is your first CTO Craft Bytes, let me tell you a little bit more about this group. It's a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world now, focused on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. Community members are over 7,000, and the CTO Craft provides them with one-to-one coaching, mentoring groups, and a curated Slack channel, and loads of events like this one as well, which is great. If you're not a member of the CTO Craft community already, and you are interested in becoming a member, I'll post some details in the chat in a second for after. A huge thank you to the headline partners, which are AWS, for helping these events happen. My name's Anna Dick. I'm currently CTO at a company called Hiring Hub and non-exec director at a company called Technation. And we've got three wonderful guests today. So I'll just quickly introduce them, and then they can tell us a little bit about themselves before we get into the main conversation. David, do you want to go first? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hi, folks. I'm David Igo, and I'm head of engineering at AO.com. So my role is about using technology to improve our business capabilities from retail, logistics, customer service, B2B, to name just a few. For clarity, I am not the expert on this panel. I'm playing the role of the experienced journeyman. So by being on this panel today, I hope I can share some of the learnings and some of the war wounds from completing our R&D claim at AO for the last 3 years.
Great. Thanks, David. Barbara.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm a technical consultant at Grantry. I work alongside Chris, and where we basically help companies identifying and claiming eligible R&D tax credit. Before joining Grantry, I was a scientist, a research scientist, so I'm coming from a little bit of a scientific background. I used to work as a mechanical engineer, researcher, and then later on got more involved in nanotechnology when I was doing my PhD at Oxford University. So nice to be here today talking to you all.
Great, thanks, Barbara. And Chris.
Yeah, and like Barbara, I also work for Grantry in the technical department. I also come from an academic background. I've been doing or specialising in this particular area of corporation tax grant funding for the last 6 years. And yeah, I can just encourage anybody, if you've got any questions throughout the conversation, please just write them in the chat box.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Chris. So I think there is, so I was just about to say about questions, you beat me to it, which is great. And there's actually an ask a question button. So I think if you press that, I think you can type in your questions for later on. Thank you. Okay, great. So Chris, I guess both yourself and Barbara work as consultants, advising probably lots of different companies every day about R&D tax credits. Have you found like an easy way to explain the scheme to anybody who's new to it? And can you share it as well, if you have?
Yeah, it's a really, really good scheme. It's something that the British government has done really fantastically well. Essentially, what it does is it gives any company that has a genuine UK presence, so they're a limited company, a PLC, and they have a research project where they're really trying to do something that's difficult or unusual or a bit challenging. It gives them a cash incentive. It gives them money to pursue their research project and hopefully grow as a business by perhaps hiring more staff, spending that rebate from Hmrc on prototyping, etc. So it's a really strong and really well thought out area of corporation tax, and most people like to have a bit of a down on Hmrc, but actually this is one area where the government really helps them.
Cool. And who's it for?
Yeah, it's basically for anybody that has as I said, a limited company, a UK presence, who is completing any sort of area of research development, of developing new product, of developing or improving a software solution, of developing an app, almost any area of business and technology it can be applied to. You just have to have something that's innovative, something that's unique, and some sort of improvement that you're trying to achieve in your company.
Okay, great. So Barbara, what have you seen count as kind of this research and development type pieces? And have you got any kind of examples that you can share that people might be able to hook into?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, generally speaking, R&D includes all of the activities that a company undertakes to innovate, introduce new products and services to the market. So it's often the first stage in the development process. But when it comes to R&D for tax credit purposes, the government R&D criteria is purposely broad. So whatever size or sector, if a company is taking a risk in achieving an advance, that is the improvement or creation of a new product, and by trying to achieve that advance is trying to attempt what Hmrc calls technological uncertainty. So that's basically any specific challenges or uncertainties that you have around whether can actually be achieved, then you might be carrying out qualifying R&D activity. So as I said, as a few examples, this could include the creation of a new product, a new process, a new services, or even the improvement or modification of an existing product. So basically creating an advance to what is already available for most people to work with. So generally speaking, you do not need to be doing rocket science to qualify for the scheme, which is a common misconception for first-time claimants. Within the government guidelines of what is defined as research and development as well, R&D doesn't necessarily have to have been successful. So that's also another misconception that people have sometimes. You have to have achieved a new product or a new process or service, because the unsuccess also demonstrates that from the outset, you didn't have any guarantees that you could actually achieve that from a technological point of view. So basically, if you're not sure your project is scientifically or technologically possible, or if you're just also not quite sure whether you can achieve that in practice, you could be resolving these technological uncertainties and then therefore qualify for the R&D tax credits relief.
Okay, great. And let's go to you, Dave. I guess you've been doing the AO tax claim for a number of years now. I mean, without being too specific, have you got any examples of the type of projects that have counted for you and why?
Yeah, sure. Probably start off by saying, I think if it's one thing that people take away from this call that we've discovered is, as Barbara said, R&D is not something you do in a lab coat. And most of the people and the activities of their teams will qualify for the R&D claims. So would it help to give some examples, I suppose?
Yeah, great.
So the process that we go through, first of all, is identifying candidates and working with our R&D advisor to, I suppose, find that sort of that Goldilocks point that you're looking for. You know, which of these candidates are representative of the work that we do? So, for example, if 90% of what you do is integrations, don't just pick that machine learning model as a write-up. So once we've got those candidates, then we drill down in a bit more detail to try and work through, first of all, what's that baseline? What's out there at the moment? So a lot of software is standing on the shoulders of giants. So if we built something, what was out in the market that didn't meet our need? So to get really specific, we used chatbot as an example of something that we created a write-up for our R&D claim. Now the starting point there, that baseline might be Google Dialogflow. For example, there's things out there that will easily help you create a chatbot. But what's that secret sauce that you put on that's that differentiator for your business? So it could be, in our space, for example, when customers are asking questions around what's the load, for example, of a washing machine. Load could mean many different things. And part of teaching that intent is how we took our customer service knowledge base and imported and integrate that into our knowledge base. So it's always up to date. And the questions customer asks, we're giving meaningful answers back. And then digging into the details of that report, once we've established that baseline, we start talking about what the technical advantages that we've made and those advances. And we also talk about the technological uncertainty. I think there's a great sort of graph on the internet. You know, when you start off an endeavor, it looks like a straight line, but in reality, it's never like that with technology. There's pitfalls, there's bumps, and it's bringing that to life. How would you capture them in the write-up to talk about the things that you've overcome, those pivots, the bumps in the road, and what you did to mitigate that sort of uncertainty?
Yeah, great. And what would you say the level of detail is that you need to go to for these kind of technical write-ups?
I think as a sort of rule of thumb, the write-up should be done by a competent professional. So it should be someone close to the work. And what we've learned over the years is it's really important you capture that information as you go along. So most people struggle to remember what they had for dinner last week. People leave companies that, you know, losing that knowledge as it walks out the door. So just writing things down is really, really important. So just someone close to work, someone competent that's close to the details of what happened in that project 6 or 12 months ago or wherever it might have been.
Yeah, great. And Barbara, have you got any, so we're talking a little bit there about the detail of it, and making sure that you're kind of documenting throughout the year to make it a little bit easier when you do the claim. Is there any kind of limit or recommendation in terms of how many of those items that you can claim for, or you should do the technical write-ups for?
Yeah, absolutely. When we're speaking about, for example, areas that you can claim R&D for, there are not necessarily a limitation of what it can be claimed. So given the broadness of the scheme, there are multiple areas of science and technology that are eligible. So this goes from, for example, a company improving a manufacturing process for a biscuit production, for example, to another trying to create a first-of-a-kind software and algorithms for new drug discovery. So within an R&D project, of course, according to the legislation, in terms of the write-up, it's advisable that you include at least 50% of the cost that you're planning on claiming for. So to the purpose of submitting a claim, you can present a representative sample of the development that you have been undertaking over the years. So you don't necessarily need to write up about every single thing you've been doing, but as long as you are capable of competently demonstrate to Hmrc that you have a good understanding of what the criteria for classifying a project as R&D or not within the scheme, that's the main purpose of the write-up. So the recommendation is that you cover an average of 3 projects, depending on how many you want to cover or you want to claim for. So let's say you have 5 internal projects. You can include a report describing the challenge that you face with 3 of those, or as many as necessary to cover around 50% of the expenditure that you're trying to claim for. But generally speaking, the main purpose of the write-up is for you to illustrate to Hmrc that you have a good understanding of what is classified as R&D within the scheme, and then you internally know which projects you should be claiming for and which ones you shouldn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So once you've got the items that you want to claim for, you've done some work around documenting those. Chris, what are the next steps in the process?
So the process is all run through the corporation tax area of Hmrc, and because it's quite generous, so we're talking for every £100,000 that you spend on R&D, you're looking at getting between £25,000 and £33,000 back from the government as a cheque. So there are obviously, and thankfully as a taxpayer, a number of checks that the tax inspectors will make on your submissions to make sure that you are, let's say, the correct claimant company. And so the things that they're looking out for is whether you are a UK-based company, whether you do have genuine expenses. So if you have a number of staff and you've been paying PAYE regularly, that's obviously a good sign for Hmrc. The other aspect is whether the projects that you're describing, and there was a question that popped up from Paul, the projects that you're describing and the level of detail that you're providing to Hmrc is sufficient for Hmrc to effectively complete their due diligence and say, yes, that is a project that maps to what we would consider research and development is according to the British government. Or perhaps that project is a little bit wishy-washy or a bit more routine, and maybe we would consider that more just to be a general business development and thus not research and development. Now, unfortunately, making the distinction between the two, it's very nuanced and it's difficult. Hmrc aren't really in a place, I'm not sure if anyone's in a place to write down, this is research and development as per the 22nd of April 2022. Research and development naturally is a progression forward. So what was research and development last year is probably pretty routine this year. So the area here that Hmrc are really looking to get into with your R&D report is what the main difficulties were, why it wasn't something that you could have given to your developer, your Python developer to build a script that would do it straight away. It would be something that would be sort of a Friday afternoon job for any competent developer within a set computer language. But no, it was a project where they had to scratch their heads, they had to try different things, they had to spend a lot of time looking on Stack, trying to figure out how potentially different components could be meshed together to get a result. That sort of iterative journey and testing out and failure, and perhaps even a project that completely didn't work at all. All of those things are great things to record in your technical narrative, because if you look at it from the end user, and the end user is a Hmrc inspector who's reading this technical narrative, and they're saying, yeah, I can see that this is a typical roadmap or typical description of a project where it wasn't certain what you were able to achieve at the start, and perhaps it didn't work, and there was a lot of iterations and there was a lot of difficulty. So yeah, it's like research and development. You can sign it off, and that's really the key to this submission.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's really key. I know we were talking when we caught up to kind of prep from this around that mindset around it doesn't have to be something that's successful. It is about that journey, about like that research and development journey in terms of trying to get through some uncertainty. And it's not about necessarily getting to what you expected the end result to be, I guess. So done the technical description side of things. I guess there's then the costing side of it in terms of how do you pull together is it called qualifying expenses? I think maybe is that the term? So Dave, how have you done that at AO? What kind of techniques have you used to kind of pull that together?
Yep. So first of all, which seems deceptively simple, it's just getting a list of the people that were involved during that period on the tax claim, and depending on the maturities of people's starters and leavers processes or HR processes, that can be a deceptively difficult task in itself. Then it's a matter of capturing things such as licensing costs that may be applicable. Cloud costs, again, is one easier to miss. It's a little bit more complex, but that's definitely one that comes with a high price tag to include. What we've done internally within AO then is, given a set of roles, we've worked with our advisor to put a percentage R&D allocation. So if you think, for example, a role such as a data scientist will have a higher percentage of R&D as part of their activities as maybe a QA, even though QA may have some automation in. So we've just created some indicative percentages. So we're doing it per role, rather than individual, just to make it a little bit easier.
Yeah. And is that, Chris or Barbara, is that quite standard in terms of that what the kind of format you see across the board, or are there different ways to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very simple, especially if you're working with a provider. We will have the financial consultant working on the claim as well. They will help you pulling out all of those eligible costs that can be included in the claim, because as David said, it's very easy sometimes to miss something that could be maximizing your claim. And then, as I said, depending on the person's involvement in the project, you can allocate them a higher percentage than others. I think one thing that is easily missed as well is supporting a personnel that is actually not directly involved in the R&D activities, but are supporting those activities to happen, and then they can be included in the claim as well. So as Chris said at the beginning, there are a lot of nuances, but generally speaking, the process is very similar to what David has described.
Okay, great. And Chris, is there any differences if you've got kind of contractors, subcontractors, IR35s, any of that kind of play into any changes?
Yeah, it's an area where you really have to concentrate. So if you have a number of subcontractors and you are a small or medium enterprise, then you are fortunately able to claim back some of the costs relating to those people. But it's capped at 65%. So if you have, for instance, a subcontractor that's spending 100% of their time doing a research and development project, the maximum you can claim back on them is 65% of their overall cost. Obviously, if you only have them working 50% of their time, then it's apportioned accordingly. The item here, and it's a question we get a lot at Grantry, and we particularly see in companies that approach us that are in inquiry, which is when Hmrc want to kind of kick the tires of a claim, is when people put unfortunately high percentages amongst staff who wouldn't normally map to having a particularly heavy research and development element to their work. So I'm talking putting sales staff on a 90% of their salary. Hmrc, they have a specialist department that look at these claims, and they know that a research scientist, a data scientist, someone who's entirely responsible for building a sandbox environment is going to have a high percentage of their costs apportioned to research and development, but perhaps a sales manager is going to have 0 or maybe 5% or very low percentages. And so when Hmrc are reviewing that, they're very much doing a smell test and saying, yeah, that looks sensible or that doesn't look sensible. But not to scare anyone off, Hmrc fully appreciate that you're trying to run a business here, you're trying to grow, and you're not running a law firm with a 6-minute timesheet, and you know what all of your developers, all your staff were doing at that level of minutiae throughout their day for the last year. They're looking for a reasonable apportionment, something that if you were questioned by an Hmrc inspector, you could say, yeah, sure, Bob did spend about half of his working time with us developing this new functionality, this new feature, and 50% of his time he was spent doing sort of sales work or bug fixing, which unfortunately didn't count.
Yeah. And Barbara, you mentioned about supporting roles. I mean, is that kind of like in terms of like management time, you know, those kind of project support or product support kind of roles that could maybe
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people that are actually helping the others that are executing the R&D to be able to execute the R&D. So supporting staff, people that are working, for example, with payroll, obviously is going to be a very small percentage of those activities that can be claimed, like Chris said. So you're not expecting those supporting roles to be put at 60, 70, 80%, but includes administrative roles within the business that are actually helping the people executing the eligible R&D activities to be performing them. So those can be included in the claim as supporting personnel as well. But as we said, in a adequate percentage of the activities, yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. And so once your claim submitted, this term came up we were discussing, which is about compliance checks. So I don't know, Barbara, do you want to tell us a little bit about what these are and why these might happen?
Absolutely, yeah. So when a company submits an R&D tax credit claim to Hmrc, then the claim is normally swiftly processed by Hmrc. They try to work on an internal 28-day deadline when they are not too overworked by too many claims being put through. But in most cases, a simple review of the claim documents with is sufficient for Hmrc to be satisfied with the process and then consider that claim submission successful. But sometimes, however, Hmrc asks for more information to clarify any questions that they might have. So this process is known as the compliance check that we were talking about, or more commonly known, as Chris mentioned before, an inquiry. So these reviews are part of Hmrc's responsibility for properly distributing developed government funds through the R&D tax incentives. So the reasons why Hmrc sometimes might open inquiry can vary a lot. So the reasoning might be related to, for example, your company or changing circumstances, for example, an increase in claim size in subsequent years, or Hmrc might have some questions about the nature of the the R&D work that you're actually conducting. So for example, if you haven't illustrated clearly enough why the challenges you're facing were challenges for competent professionals in the field as well, or why you believe a certain project that you put forward in your technical description is eligible for the scheme, Hmrc might want to clarify some points about that as well. And this is done through the compliance check. So in summary, it's very interesting for business to try to avoid an inquiry, mainly because it's a very time-consuming process. Sometimes it can drag for a few months, even a whole year. And on top of taking away the time of the people actually executing their R&D activities within the business and actually trying to make it grow, it also is going to delay how long it's going to take for the company to receive that benefit back. And then also filing subsequent claims, because while your inquiry is going on, it's advised that you don't apply for any extra claims, because they could just be dragged into the inquiry process as well. So this is why from the beginning it's very interesting that you have a well-prepared claim that you can submit to Hmrc and withstand the scrutiny that is going to put on it. Yeah, so basically that's it. So if anybody else has any questions about compliance check, we can chat a little bit more about it at the end, especially because in the last few months we have experienced an increase in inquiries, specifically within the software field. So we've seen there has been a change in Hmrc's approach towards it. But basically that's what it is.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for that. It's been interesting. David, have you ever had one of these compliance checks at all?
Thankfully not, so we must be doing something right.
I know you work with a third party that kind of helps you put that together. I mean, do you think that is a really supporting and helpful piece in terms of making sure that you haven't got to that point where you've had to go through the compliance checks?
Yeah, definitely, and it's not saying just because there's people on the call as well, but it's a specialism. So to speak to people that have just done this before and can stay away from all the pitfalls, and the goal really is to avoid those compliance checks. And that's the sort of insight that they can give you, because they've submitted tens, if not hundreds, of these claims before.
Yeah. So the benefit of investing in actually working with somebody who's an expert, actually, you can save you a lot of time and potentially get that money in quickly as well. Okay, cool. Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about the financial side of things, the role of, because I guess particularly the CFO or accountants that are also working on this kind of thing with the technical side?
Yeah, it's a fairly simple area actually. There's basically two tranches. One is for a small or medium-sized enterprise, and one is for a large enterprise. And Hmrc make the distinction by the number of staff you have. If you have fewer or more than 500 staff, if you have a turnover more than 100 million euros, or if you have 86 million euros on your balance sheet. So everybody's like, well, great, almost anybody is a SME. But there are a few distinctions that will artificially put you into a large company scheme, which is far less generous. And those include if you have, say, a investor who has more than 5% stock holding in your company, who is a wealthy investor who has a lot of other large companies that would have staff that numbers that would exceed 500. And unfortunately, you're also dragged into the large company scheme along with any other company that he owns. And also, if you have what they call state notifiable aid, and that usually takes the form of sort of a grant. So if you have an H2020 grant, anything like that, where the government effectively has already given you money to complete a project, Hmrc don't particularly want to pay out twice, so they put you on the less generous large company scheme. And so just to give you a bit of an insight, a large company scheme will give you around about 10% of all of your R&D costs back, and typically takes about 3 months for Hmrc to process. The small company scheme will give you up to a third of your R&D costs back, and only takes 28 days to process. So there's a real benefit to making sure that you're within the small company scheme.
Yeah, great. Sorry, I think, Chris, I don't know if there's some feedback coming from your mic or one of the mics a little bit. Oh,
I think it's Barbara's.
I think it was maybe Barbara. Sorry. So thanks for that, Chris. Once you've got a successful claim, then what are the kind of option in terms of the actual kind of cash money, and how does that vary depending on like the decisions that people might make depending where their business is at a certain time?
This is a really good question, and it's very dependent on your specific situation. So a number of clients we work with are pre-revenue and very much looking for cash now in order to expand their development team. And so what Hmrc allows you to do is what they call a surrender. You surrender the R&D losses that you've generated for a one-off cash payment, and that cash payment is in effect 33% of all your R&D costs. But you cannot carry forward those R&D costs to write off against profit in a future accounting period. The other aspect that you can look into is if you are anticipating that you're going to make a large profit in the next year or so, and you have no real request for the money at this moment in time, you can carry forward the R&D losses and use them to extinguish future corporation tax costs for the next financial years. And that is actually the best way of using the R&D scheme if you're in that particular situation. And finally, if you are lucky enough to be making a large profit, the R&D scheme simply reduces the amount of corporation tax that you have to pay, which is, again, great.
Yeah, definitely. I've also heard pre-revenue companies, you can sometimes get a loan against your R&D claim as well, if you were in a situation as well where you need to get some cash quicker, I guess. Yeah.
So this is effectively an invoice factoring feature, and a number of companies out there will do it, where the asset that you are considering against the loan is in effect the government rebate. And it certainly is useful if you have particularly a situation where maybe in Q1 you've spent a lot of money on subcontractors and you have a huge amount of bills, which then you could use this invoice factoring system to get the cash back and continue working through Q3 and Q4.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Okay, I think we've got some questions coming in, but just before we get onto them, I just wanted to just go around and just have like the key kind of pointer of advice that each of you might give for doing a claim. So David, do you want to give us what's your go-to advice for doing a tax R&D claim?
Yeah, sure. I think our main learning as we've sort of matured through this process is, as with most reports, the bulk of the work is gathering the supporting data. Bad looks like staring at a blank sheet of paper, mining your inbox for information or Jira tickets or whatever it might be. But when you look at some of the pieces of information needed for the R&D claim, they could almost just fall under best practice. So one of the areas we've moved towards is almost like a post-initiative review. So if you're capturing, what went well, what didn't, how did we overcome it, it's beneficial for your team and just continuous improvement. And it also means that information is just available to you when you come to write up these claims. So, the goal is just to get to a point where it's almost just copy and paste, as opposed to wondering, that person left the company 6 months ago with all that knowledge, what do we fill in with this detail? So it's just baking it into your process. I think that's what we've learned most of all.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Barbara, from you.
Yeah. I think for me, a lesson is for when you're preparing your technical description, just try to be as simple as you can. I mean, it's very important for you to strike a good balance between being technical enough so Hmrc inspector knows that you're actually performing a research and development within a technological field, but also making it easier for them to evaluate and understand what were you doing was challenging from a technical point of view, because They go through an immense amount of claims every month. The inspector will be examining claims, as I said, in a biscuit factoring research and development project to a software development. So as clear as you can make for them to understand what you're doing, what's challenging in representing an advance to the field you are operating in as well, the easier it will for them to assess and then consider your claim successful.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I guess that kind of can shorten the process as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Chris.
Yeah, it's a few things. I suppose the one thing, the really important thing to get across is that the R&D scheme is for everybody. If you've done anything interesting, if you've developed anything, or you've got a real difficult project or something that failed, do look into it. It's something that the government wants to encourage businesses in the UK to spend more money on research and development to develop their company further. And the second thing, and it's a really important point that David raised there, if you're like David and have a huge team of devs, or if you are a one-man band, it's very important to try and get all of the information that you need to write the technical report to submit to Hmrc as early as physically possible, to make decent notes. If you've got a prototype that you're developing, if you can take a photo of it just to jog your memory later on, brilliant. If you can take notes from whichever Jira or Asana or whatever system you're using for projects that don't work particularly well, please do. Those are exactly what you need to prove to Hmrc that the project that you're working on was research and development and wasn't an easy project to achieve. And then when you come to the point of putting it all together, having this I guess treasure trove of information, of notes, of photographs, just makes it so much easier to remember what you were doing and to correctly write your claim. And that's, I guess, my one piece of advice. Don't leave it too late, and if at all possible, just try and be as organised as possible and record what you're doing through the financial year.
Yeah, definitely. I guess that helps if somebody leaves as well. Just making sure that you've got some of those notes kind of recorded, so you're not relying on that information that's in that one person's head who left 3 months ago.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very painful process. We've seen a number of founders who really could do with the cash, but they can't put together a claim because, as you say, their CTO has left. They've departed on bad terms with a key subcontractor, and they don't know what they were doing. Or they have a situation where their staff are not inclined to really get into get into discussion of what they found difficult during the year. I mean, who wants to admit that they really weren't very good at this particular area of this particular development in Python? They couldn't get this MATLAB toolbox to work properly, and it took them 3 weeks. It's not something you want to do as a dev, but this is exactly what you need to be speaking to your devs about and getting this recorded. What was difficult? What did take the time? As much detail as possible, and you'll find the R&D process absolutely smooth sailing.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that insight. So let's move on to questions for the last 20 minutes, if that's okay. So we'll have a little look. So first question, looks like it's all the way from Canada, from Dennis. So one challenge I've faced is that as a SaaS startup, it's hard to undertake a project that might not succeed because you must have traction in sales. So you tend to play it safe and build what's needed to sell. How can a company like this take advantage of the credits? Anybody want to, Chris or Barbara, do you want to have a think about that one?
Sure. So again, it's a situation that we do see. There are going to be elements of what you do as a day-to-day development, Dennis, that are routine, i.e. you are perhaps using a piece of software you developed in a previous financial year and modifying it slightly for a particular client. Now, Hmrc would view that as a routine development, i.e. there's not that much difficulty, there's not that much uncertainty, but there may be a large amount of time that your developers are having to put in to make that alteration. But I would imagine there are other areas where you've perhaps added a new feature, a new functionality that you didn't have in a previous financial year, that you're having to test it for a client that's operating in a field that you haven't worked on before, that you have perhaps an integration or a difficulty with an external partner that you have to get your system to work with. All of those things would be considered as research and development projects. So just because it's an area where perhaps you are a little bit more conservative on your build than you would be if you were given unlimited time and unlimited finance, there's still going to be some components in all likelihood that are falling within the scheme.
Yeah. Okay.
And just to add to that as well, I think the phrase that called out to me in there is build what's needed to sell, and that's not particularly easy. Different scale, but within AO we found product and OKR and objectives lend very well to R&D. So the fact that you're doing experimentation, you've got this objective or key result you're trying to work towards, but you don't know what's going to move the needle. So things such as A/B testing, UX designs, anything like that are all just forms of R&D as well.
Yeah, definitely. That's when you've got a problem or a challenge that you just don't know how to solve it. There's many steps, isn't there, you might go through that could count as R&D as well. Okay, great. Thanks, Dennis. Hopefully that's helped there. Moving on to the next one. We've got Federico, and I think we might have covered this a little bit, but what kind of companies usually apply for these credits? Startups, scale-ups, for mature companies?
Yeah, companies of, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, companies of different sizes apply. We have had experiences with companies coming from the startup side of things until bigger companies that profit more from the less generous scheme, as Chris mentioned before, like larger corporations. So there is really not a specification in terms of how big or how small your company might be to be able to claim R&D tax credit. The only differentiator is going to be to reach specific benefits you're going to be basically qualifying for is the more generous side of the scheme or the slightly less generous side of the scheme.
Yeah, I know I've definitely worked at startups. There's been 3 of us. We're building out an MVP product really early on, tiny company, and we were able to do, a claim. It's more about the nature of the discovery and research and development that we're doing rather than the size of the company.
Absolutely, yeah. And then when you're in a startup as well, you're trying to do things sometimes in a different way than it's traditionally done. That either being because you're trying to do it more efficiently or something that will cost you less in terms of like a process or a product. So that could be some R&D being done in that as well. So being a small business doesn't necessarily mean that you're not conducting research and development activities. If anything, it's probably incentivize you even further to create something new that then you can be using for claiming for the relief.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so we've got one from Robin. So this might be for you, Chris. If contractor costs are capped at 65% and they spend 50% of their time on R&D, what does that mean? Does that mean you can claim all of their R&D time or 65% of the 50%, i.e. 32.5% of their cost?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's the less generous 32.5%. You have to apportion the apportionment. The other aspect that Hmrc are bringing in for financial years that started after April 2021 is what they call the PAYE cap, where you can only claim 3 times your total PAYE liability or £20,000. And that is basically to try and encourage UK companies to put more of their subcontractors on payroll, because it's good for the government, it's good for society. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm not sure if that kind of half answers the one below as well, which is from Federico again. So is there a cap in the amounts that can be claimed, or is it just a percentage of X?
Yeah, there is an amount that is capped, and that is €8 million per year. So as I said, it's really, unless you're a FTSE 100 company, unless you're BP, it's unlikely that you're going to be getting up to that sort of level of expenditure, because you'd have to be spending on the order of 20 to 30 million pounds a year on R&D. So that's not necessarily a problem. The things that I guess the traps people fall into more often at sort of the smaller company stage is, as I say, if you have, for instance, a grant, it will put you artificially into the large company scheme. And we've had people who have got grants of only £5,000, £10,000, basically poisoning their R&D claim. And instead of being able to get 33% back on a £500,000 expenditure, they're only able to get 10% back. So it means that the grant actually was a negative. And those sort of things, you need to have a real strong think about whether it's something that you are going to want to do. So another one would be, maybe some people on the audience have taken them out, CBILS, the COVID bounce back loans. If you have R&D that basically has been financed by a CBIL payment, then unfortunately that is also on the less generous large company scheme. So therefore you have to, I suppose you have to have a bit of foresight as to where the money's coming from and how you structure your finance internally as a company. Otherwise you can lose out on large chunks of the R&D scheme, which would be very unfortunate. And we have unfortunately seen it for some people that contact us.
So are there any other criteria? So you talked about grants and specifically about that CBIL there. Are there any other kind of high-level criteria that would push companies into that higher, less favourable bracket?
Yeah, so I had, for instance, a company who had a large investment from a person who owns a retail chain, and obviously retail chain, huge number of staff. And so instantly their company, which was a 3-man band, was considered a large company by Hmrc because they had to include all of the retail staff that their investor had effectively brought into them.
Yeah.
It's for shareholding that is above 25%. So if you have an angel investor who's only putting in a few percent, it's not a problem. But if you do have a substantial investment, it's I guess a question that you have to ask, whether it's going to poison your R&D claim. The other thing that we've seen is regional governments, particularly within Wales, offer incentives to employ local people, and unfortunately, again, these fall under the state aid rules. And so, if you have, for instance, developers, etc., working on a project, and they were part financed by a local authority, then again, you can't claim at 33%. You can only claim at the 10%. So things that may look good to apply for first time round, unfortunately, they can have this poisoning effect on your R&D claim. And it's something to sort of look at and talk to your advisors, talk to your accountants about just before you, I guess, sign on the dotted line. Yeah,
that's great to know, to have those discussions up front. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Okay, let's, we've got time for a couple more questions. Okay, so Dave, maybe you, because you have avoided inquiry, what would be your tips on how to avoid an inquiry?
Yeah, it wasn't intentional. I think it's more by accident.
Must be doing something right, though.
I think it's just investing the time early on so you don't have to pay that penalty later. I think erring on the side of caution, going into a little bit more detail. So you've got some substance behind your claims. So by not being afraid to provide the technical details to preempt it coming back to you. So we're sort of erring on the side of caution, I would say, and providing the technical details and going into the adversity. So it just doesn't look like a straight line. It's through this process. We experimented, we pivoted. And then that just leads to that, reinforcing that the uncertainty is there, and that's what you've overcome.
Yeah, great. Barbara, have you got anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I think this links nicely to something that I said earlier. Try to make it simple for the inspector. That's exactly what Dave's saying. It's like putting enough details to support the work that you've been doing, but also clearly illustrate that journey that you've been going through in terms of iterations and testing and back and forth to actually accomplish that final result. I think what Dave said earlier on as well is very important, having a good record keeping measures in place, because later on, if, for example, the person heading the R&D project left the company, but you still really want to put a claim forwards, you might not have enough details, technical details to support all of the expenditure that you're trying to claim for. So that could end up representing a very risky claim. So basically that's it. And putting all of that together, demonstrating to Hmrc that you have a good understanding of the guidelines for the scheme through your technical description. Weirdly enough, as we were commenting the other day when we were preparing for this, the legislation doesn't necessarily require you to submit a technical description, what is called a technical narrative, for you to be able to claim for the benefits. But basically not having that, it's asking for an inquiry these days. And Hmrc has been increasing massively the scrutiny that is being put on claims. So if you can provide the necessary information for the inspector to carry out the due diligence more easily, more swiftly, that's the best measures for you to try to avoid an inquiry.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Okay, and I think we've got one final question from Paul. So who typically compiles the report in the company? Chris, have you got any kind of or Barbara, a general view in what you've seen across?
I thought David might have a.
I was going to say the same.
We've personally found, so it's someone not in the weeds, so probably it's not developers, but senior developers, principals, architects, middle managers. So just that level removed from the detail, because again, it can take some time to compile these. So someone with a bit of thinking space, but you do need to go down to the detail. So as long as that expert, that SME is at hand, I'd expect that sort of level removed from the developer would be ideal for that.
Okay.
Yeah, that maps very closely to people who work with Barbara and myself.
Yeah.
I suppose the thing to add is I know a lot of people that have new companies that they've launched maybe straight out of university, etc. They've only got a couple of people on their payroll and their R&D claim is tiny, but they have a really good handle on what the development was, what the difficulties were. You can write your own R&D report if you want, if you know what the difficulties were and you can describe it to Hmrc. Actually, there is information out there that will enable you to do it yourself. Our website, grantry.co.uk, we actually detail how to write your own R&D report if you're interested. Hmrc has a number of examples on something called CIRD, which is CIRD. If you search for that on Google, you can see what Hmrc are looking for. So if you are at that early stage, I strongly don't be afraid to have a look at this and see if you can write your own report. It's not saying that Hmrc require you to have a specialist or accountant to do it for you. What we find at Grantry is that companies that are a bit larger tend to want to have their devs that are often on quite decent salaries working on projects as opposed to writing tax documents. So we tend
that's what they want to be doing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So they tend to want to minimize the amount of discussion, the amount of time that it takes to give their advisors the information in order that a report is generated. I'm sure David's got a very good system there with his advisors. It means that he's not using too much dev time. So it's just finding the right system that works for you, and then making sure that, as Barbara said, that you really front load the effort, that you give Hmrc as much as they're going to want to complete their due diligence on your claim, and so you don't end up getting stung with these sort of questions that Hmrc will ask if there are a few things in your report that aren't entirely clear for them or they need to ask questions over.
Yeah. Okay. Super. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So thank you so much for all the insight there. I think I wish I'd have been part of this conversation 3 years ago when I embarked on my first R&D tax claim. And thanks to everybody who has asked some questions there and went further into the details, that was brilliant. I'm just going to post into the chat the details of the speakers today. So if anybody wants to connect up with them, then go ahead and do that. That's great. I also was going to mention that there's a new free CTO conference that's coming out, and it's all about the recruitment arc side of things. Lots of great speakers planned for that one as well. So take a look at that. The link again is in the chat. And I think that's everything covered. So yeah, just a massive thank you for everybody involved. And yeah, have a lovely weekend.